Today, I'll be talking about the ever-evolving landscape of smart cities, focusing on civic synergy. Before I move ahead and talk further about, like smart cities and how the civic synergy happens in them, I would like to put this question, So, for example, imagine if a city is a reflecting mirror for its inhabitants. So when we see the city, what do we see? Do we see people who make the decisions for us? Do we see the architects, the urban planners? Do we see citizens or the community? And the reason why I'm putting this question is not for rhetorical reasons, but also in next slides, I'll be further discussing about why this is important to understand who are actually the key parts of the city. And to understand it more, I'll discuss a little bit about the term stakeholder. So I'm sure everyone has been using the term stakeholder in different contexts, But historically, the term stakeholder, as per the English law, was about a third person who was not interested in whatever was going on, but he was just holding the stakes so that he could give it to the winner of the bet. But over the years, the term has evolved, the meaning has changed like drastically, and now stakeholder is mainly someone who is interested. It can be an individual, it can be a company, an organization, anyone who is getting affected by all the decisions that are being made and who have a part to play in the decisions. Now let's imagine, like what a stakeholder would be in a smart city ecosystem. And I really like metaphors, so I'm gonna use the metaphor of a beehive here to discuss the stakeholders. So let's imagine a smart city as a thriving beehive, So we have the residents, those are like the worker bees, who are doing the heavy lifting and making sure the beehive is thriving. Then we have the local businesses who are stirring the honeypot. They are trying to get businesses done. They are making the money and making it financially stable. Then we have the government, which could be thought of like the queen bee, who is responsible for directing all the actions. Then we have the technology companies, who are also kind of the lifelines, who are making sure that everything is connected and stay together and the interaction is happening dynamically. And then we have the marginalized groups, which are more like, the drones in a beehive. Usually, they are always like marginalized, but they are very important for a beehive to thrive properly. So the idea why I wanted to compare a smart city to beehive was like, it's always important to understand how the stakeholders can actually interact together. And if one of the buzz is not heard properly, then maybe the smart city won't thrive. Now, to move on from understanding what the stakeholders could be and actually looking into a smart city concept, the dynamics in smart city, they change based on who the stakeholder is. So usually, we can have multiple stakeholders. We can have the city government that have more influence on the decisions that are made. We have the tech companies that are also influential in terms of decision making. We have the citizens who are primarily, on the receiving end most of the time, but they also have limited influence. And then we have the nonprofit organizations and other key actors. But in most of the contexts, the power imbalance is quite clear. Most of the time, you see that some stakeholders have a lot to add to the city, but the way in which they can actually contribute toward decision making is very limited. And what it does is it creates this power struggle where some of the key stakeholders, they have more say than the other stakeholders who are also the key actors within the cities. And that somehow leads to inequitable outcomes. Now, I'm sure like this is very well studied already, and a lot of people have discussed in research as well as in real world experiments. But there are several very important examples, which I'm sure a lot of you have come across, which show how these inequalities or the unequal treatment can be easily understood. And one of the example is the Songdo International Business District in South Korea. So the idea behind having this city of the future was to have something which is well connected using all the sensors and all the modern technology and having a sustainable design. But what it lacked was a social cohesion. So there was no focus on what the culture of the city would be, or how would people interact, or whether it will preserve the local traditions. So it was mainly about making it high tech with very limited focus on the local culture and social infrastructure. And the failure of this initiative was that the lesson that we learned from this was that a city is not just an infrastructure, but it's more like an integrated framework where you have the people, the technology, and everything working together side by side. Another example that I would like to share is the project Greenlight. So the idea behind this project, again, was good. So the intention was, I think, the good. They wanted to do real-time surveillance for understanding crime and also to reduce the crime. But the problem that happened was there was a lot of racial profiling. And this was very frequently used during the Black Lives Matter protests. So what was happening was they were using to understand if there was anyone who was not following the social distancing. And then those people were reported, and mainly it was focused on the minority groups. And that's why there was a lot of talk about how these applications or programs or frameworks were designed for the betterment of the society, but the end result was always something very drastic. And one more example for it is the Sidewalks Labs in Toronto, like Professor Helbing mentioned, that again, the idea was to have a data-driven society, which is super efficient and effective, but what it lacked was lack of transparency about what's going to be what will happen with the data. And the lesson we learn from is like it underscores the importance of stakeholder involvement. So in the end, all these projects were started with a good intention, but they didn't work out because what it lacked was they didn't really pay attention to who the key stakeholders are. So when we talk about the term stakeholders, it can include everyone, literally whosoever is part of the city, but there's always a special group of people who would be affected the most. And most of the smart city projects that often fail, they fail to take that into account. Now, all these solutions, like they are quite tech-based, very heavy, but sometimes we see that even simple solutions are really useful in terms of how they can be used to connect with people and to make sure that they are used in the way they were expected to be used. For example, here's this one picture that I'm showing. It's actually a pizza box collection thing. I came across during our team retreat, and in most of the places around the parks, you see, people eat the pizza, then just throw them out. But the way it was designed was to convey the message that, people can simply just follow it. So I would say it's a form of nudging, but positive nudging where the behavior is kind of nudged towards more positive outcome. And it's not just this example. There are several other examples. For example, this ad by WWF about paper dispenser, just to let people know how the wastage of paper actually affects something. So it's very simple yet very effective. And what happened? And this one example is from London. I think this was from back in 2015. So they had a lot of problem with cigarette litter. So they created this Ronaldo versus Messi, and people starting putting the cigarette butts in the right one because it's kind of gamification, but also the overall idea behind it was very good, and that led people to connect with these things. So the reason why I'm showing these examples is, although you see there is nothing technical about it, nothing smart, which talks about ICT or things, but the people who made these things, they could connect with the people. And when I say people, it's like the citizens of the cities or different areas. So when those stakeholders, the key actors of this whole city infrastructure, they can be considered as they are well valued, you see a change. And now for cities to actually work with people, there are several instruments people can use. So citizen science, for example, is one of the key things that has emerged over the years, where researchers are trying to work with the citizen community directly or indirectly by including them in the projects to make sure that they can be considered as an important part of any sort of research that is targeted toward the smart city development, where people can actually contribute not just by their data, but also by ideas. So primarily, citizen science research, like if you look at the papers, it talks a lot about crowdsourcing. So this is a word crowd that is based on almost 650 papers from 2008 till 2023. And you would see the crowdsourcing is quite there. You can easily see. Now, everyone defines crowdsourcing in a very different way. So if you just tell someone like a citizen that, oh, we want to use this thing because we want data, that doesn't generally motivate someone, because you want them to connect with the project in a way that they have some sort of an ownership. So what I have been doing over the past few years is I've been looking into understanding how we can actually use digital technology, but in a way where people are not just used as a data source, but rather than they feel like they are owners of the project, they are within the project since the initiation till the end, so that they don't feel like they're only used for a certain part of the project. And that does help in understanding how they can be used for the real life projects. So for example, later I'll show you some projects where I was involved for environment monitoring. But before that, I would also like to mention that while most of the projects, they still are about data, data acquisition, trying to understand how people can generate data. And often what it does is it neglects a certain part of society. For example, if I'm just using some citizen science project in a certain part of the city, I would be only focusing on a very small proportion of the population. So while I'll be able to get good data, maybe have very good results to show, but still it won't be fair in terms of it won't be representative of that particular city. And that is exactly the same when it comes with smart cities, where you have a lot of technology and you want to have this infrastructure to give services to people, but often who gets the benefit, that always remains a question. And it's not always the people who need the benefit, but sometimes they are the neglected group. And okay, not me. So there are also several challenges when it comes to citizen science. For example, the data quality and validation. For example, if you are using citizen sensors or citizen sensing frameworks, there's always a question, how can you believe the data? How do you do the validation? So there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed. For example, creating these frameworks where there's open and transparent data sharing with the government as well as with the people, then to understand how you can actually do participant retention, because that is one of the very key concerns in citizen science project, that most times people are motivated in the beginning, but over the time they lose interest. And one of the reasons why they lose interest is because if they're just used for data collection, they're not being involved in the rest of the parts. So there's no way to keep them involved. Then the idea about scalability, like how can you start a project with people, but also scale it up, and accessibility of technology, because technology is not easily accessible for everyone. For example, like my background is engineering. So when I make something, maybe several years ago, I would be thinking from an engineer perspective that, oh, I put it out there, people will use it. But that's very different from how it actually works in the real life. So to understand what are the barriers in the adoption of technology is also key. And then there are a lot of ethical issues, like Professor Helbing mentioned about value-sensitive design. So we have also been looking into that, like how does someone, we can make sure that people own the data. Because in the end, if you are collecting the data, it's your data. And whether to share it or not, it should be allowed for the individual to decide. Then the digital divide, where some people are more tech savvy, they can work with all kinds of instruments and sensors, but then there are some people who cannot. And inclusivity and representation, which is also a very key part of these kind of projects, where you want to involve every section of the society to have a very well-balanced discussion. So there are different typologies of citizen science projects, and most of them, they are either contributory, collaborative, or co-created projects. For us, we have been really focusing on the co-created projects, so that we have people from the initiation till the end of the project. So it's more about understanding what people want to study, but in more scientific way. So we get their insights, we get the knowledge, the local knowledge, which is very important to frame these projects, and then we start working on it. While these projects are easy to start, I think one of the most difficult part is how can you make sure that there is enough participation as well as active participation. So while this looks very simple, like idea of increasing participation, some of the key steps here are, we are looking into how we can map the key actors in the community network. So what we have looked into is that, for example, you have some people who are coming from higher power places, then you have people like, regular citizens showing their motivation and participating in these kind of activities. There are always these structural relationships like cooperation, influence, and disagreement that can be a barrier in a sense, how much someone will integrate within the project or how they will actually participate or give their feedback. So one of the key steps that we are looking into is like how we can address these internal conflicts as well as these forward challenges as well as issues. While it's easy to interpret these challenges, sometimes it becomes a little difficult to actually do it in real life. And I'll give you one example of one of the projects that I was involved in. So Taiwan and most of the East Asian countries, they usually struggle with a lot of pollution. And it's not mainly just traffic related pollution, like based on from the emissions, but also it's also weather challenges that not controllable and things like that. So we started this research project, which was called an Airbox project, where we wanted to enable, empower, and engage people. So we used a lot of low-cost sensors. We made it open source so that the maker community or the fab labs, they could also participate in this whole method. So the spirit of the whole project was, we have open source hardware, open source software, as well as open data. So from the transparency point of view, we were making sure that it's as transparent as possible so that people actually, like there's a equal partnership or the relationship is quite good. So we started this in 2015, and the sensor stations you are looking at, they are from the Environmental Protection Agency. So there were 77 stations at that time. By the end of last year, we have almost 12,000 sensors. So we have already covered the entire island, all the administrative units. And one thing which I would like to focus here is, like, it was a research project, and within a research project, it's very difficult to do what we were able to do. And I think what we did was we found the key stakeholders right at the beginning of the project. And we didn't want to alienate anyone. So we had people working from the industry. We had people working from NGOs, from maker groups, and from all different categories, who could participate in that. And then what we tried to find out who is good at what, because imagine there is a company, they just want to do business, but our idea was not business because it's an open source thing, but they could still like do some sort of collaboration where everyone learns from each other. So the idea was to do it in a fair way where everyone learns from each other, but also contributes to the bigger picture. Now, once we had the whole island mapped and we were getting real-time data, the data was validated with the EPA. Like we discussed earlier, having thousands of sensors doesn't mean anything unless you can make sense of the data, because in the end, how you use it is more important. So we started working on different applications. For example, one of the applications was where we used this data to compare the route choice with Google algorithm to understand how healthy your route is. Because a lot of people, for example, this was mainly for people who are into running or biking. So you are more exposed to the emissions, especially if you're doing it roadside. So that was one of the ways in which we try to make sense of data. Then we also looked into how we can use this open source data to add a service for the people. The idea was a lot of people are worried about their children, like, for example, if the air quality is good, if they're going outside to play. So this system allowed them to have this alert service, which would let them know how good or how bad it was, whether it's good enough for physical exercises or they should refrain from going outside. Now, we did the part of understanding how we can use data-driven applications to inform people. But we also looked into how we can use the data as evidence to do action. And one of the examples was we looked into how this data can be used to assist schools to make more informed choices about when to have these activities, when they should do, is it good? Yeah, like when they should have physical activities outside. So the idea was just to make sure that whatever data we have can be used for more positive functions. We also try to look into the cultural aspect of this. So, like every place has a different culture, and how they see technology is also very different. For example, we try to understand how do people see, religious practices. So, for example, in East Asia, they use a lot of incense burning, which is about, like it's religion, and it's very hard to compare science and religion in most of the places. But what we did was we tried to make them understand that this doesn't mean that it's against religion. It's more like to inform people how this thing can be done. And what the idea was to help people just get more aware, realize the importance, and then we were able to kind of convince people to actually use it for the temples, and it had some positive features as well, and the results were quite positive. I would say we were not expecting this, but then I think it was mainly because of the interest of the people as well as the other. And I wanted to continue the same things, when I moved to Switzerland. So I started looking into how good or bad Swiss air quality is. So according to the perceived notion, Switzerland is super clean. But then I looked into it and I found out, okay, it's not as clean as it sounds like, especially when people are really into outdoor activities. They are going outside and, enjoying outdoor activities. It makes sense to understand more. And I was a bit surprised to see that for the entire Switzerland, they only have like 16 official monitoring stations, which is really low for a country of this size. And most of these stations are actually in suburban areas. So they're not even in the cities, which is, again, surprising. So we started this Know the Air You Breathe initiative, where we started working with people. Like, we started having these co-creation workshops where we involved people. And the first idea was to understand how much people actually know about it. So some people were aware, but majority of the people were not aware of how bad it is, or whether they should be worried about it or not. And we really didn't want to put it in a scary way, but we wanted to make sure people understand that this is important and it's useful. And based on this activity, we created these prototypes which people used for indoor air quality monitoring. And the main motivation was, during COVID time, a lot of people were spending time indoors. And even in our life, we spend more than 90% of time indoors, just like now, school, offices, homes. So it makes sense to know what kind of air are you breathing. Are there any things you can do to safeguard it or to make it better? And the results were quite good, because we saw that people wanted to participate more when they have a shared understanding of the issue at hand. Also, when they know that their knowledge, as well as the data they contribute, can actually create a bigger impact. And we also discussed like how we can move from data intelligence to civic intelligence. While all the technologies are really good, they can help us to get a lot of data, to make sense of the data. But in order to make sure that people actually use it and they kind of start working with it to understand, we discussed how we can have more human-centric technologies, which are value-sensitive, design-based, as well as ethically based, so that all the data ownership rests with the people. To further understand this, we created this evidence co-creation framework, which included all these principles that I have been working on and that we discussed during the last few years. And one of the key part that we thought of was the empathy mapping thing. So usually my problem won't be similar to your problem. And sometimes if we really want to understand whether we understand each other's problem, it should be putting each other in each other's shoes, so that we know, okay, this is an important problem and maybe it has to be discussed in a joint fashion. So we created this framework where we had a social component, which involved a lot of people. We had the component of data transparency and accuracy, where we did this device calibration. We had a data analysis and processing step where we created this no-code algorithms, where even if citizens, they wanted to participate, they could just use these apps directly without need of any coding. So this gives them a sense of more, ownership, where they don't have to depend on data scientists just to analyze it. So it can be done in a collaboration where they can give local contextual insights, as well as allow us to understand what is actually happening with their data at a certain point of time. And then the last component is about data sharing, like how we can create a narrative around the data so that it's easily accessible as well as acceptable for mass audience. Now, throughout this process, we have been also looking into why is it so difficult to actually get it through or to realize it on the ground? It's mainly because there are still a lot of questions. And these questions are like the ones which I would like to conclude my presentation, can we actually have citizens design the smart cities? It's still an open question. Some people will say yes, some people will say no, it's not truly possible. But I feel there is always an opportunity based on the experience that we have. Then what it means for data. How can you actually democratize data? Then how can you transform them from passive consumers to active co-creators, where they are actively involved in the process? Then what's the role of technology in inclusion? And how can we balance efficiency and ethics by focusing on the key rights, the digital rights that a human should have, and whether it should be collaboration and or competition. And yeah, I think that will be me. And thank you for giving me time.